The brass pressure gauge slipped from High's numbed fingers, clinking softly against the flooded concrete floor, before rolling into a dark, swirling puddle of muddy rainwater. Outside, the storm did not just howl. It tore at the rusted, corrugated iron roof of Mile 12 Rescue Station like an invisible beast trying to claw its way inside. For 18 consecutive hours, the mountain pass, known as the Death Ridge, had been swallowed by an impenetrable wall of gray rain, turning the steep asphalt road into a treacherous, slick trap for any driver foolish enough to brave the dark. I did not look at the fallen gauge immediately. He stood frozen under the flickering yellow bulb of his open garage bay, his sallow face lined with deep crevices of exhaustion, his breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs of white mist against the freezing air. His denim jacket, patched at the elbows with coarse canvas and stiff with dried grease, was completely soaked through at the shoulders, clinging heavily to his thin, slightly stooped frame. Every joint in his 56-year-old body ached with a dull, persistent throbbing, a cruel reminder of the 3 heavy truck tires he had manually changed since noon without a single bite of food. But the ache in his bones was nothing compared to the cold, suffocating weight pressing down on his chest whenever his eyes drifted toward the old, plastic-cased digital clock mounted above his grease-stained workbench. It was 4:14 a.m. in exactly 3 hours. The administration office at the City Central Hospital would open its windows, and the head nurse of the cardiac ward would look for his name on the daily register. If the remaining 40 million VND for his wife Mai's valve replacement surgery was not deposited by 8 a.m., her name would be pushed to the bottom of the waiting list for another 3 long months. 3 months that the doctor had explicitly told him her fragile, failing heart did not have. Suddenly, a low, guttural roar vibrated through the concrete beneath his heavy rubber boots, a sound distinct from the rhythmic thumping of the rain or the cracking of thunder overhead. It was the aggressive, high-pitched scream of a highly tuned, low-clearance engine pushing its limits up the steep incline of the pass. Through the sheets of cascading water, a pair of piercing, icy blue LED headlights cut through the darkness, blinding for a split second as the vehicle skidded violently around the sharp bend just 50 yards away. The screech of tires fighting for traction on wet asphalt tore through the night air, followed by the harsh, metallic scrape of carbon fiber tearing against a low boulder at the edge of the road. With a frantic, desperate rev of its engine, the sleek, low-slung Italian sports car bolted forward, swerving erratically before slamming its brakes and sliding sideways right into the dry shelter of High's garage overhang. The expensive engine died with a sharp, metallic cough, leaving only the furious clicking of cooling metal and the heavy thud of water striking the low hood. The passenger door remained shut, but the driver's side opened with a sharp, aggressive hiss, throwing a beam of interior, ambient violet light onto the wet concrete. A young man stepped out, his immaculate white designer sneakers instantly plunging into an inch of dirty, oil-slicked water that had pooled near the entrance. Fong did not curse at the weather. He cursed at the station, his voice sharp, arrogant, and laced with the unearned confidence of a man who believed every square inch of the earth could be bought, managed, or swept away by his father's checkbook. He shook his dripping arm, a massive, rose-gold luxury watch flashing under the dim garage bulb as he glared at the ancient tire changers, the rusted hydraulic jacks, and finally, at the quiet, unmoving figure of High. "Hey, old man," Fong shouted, his voice cutting through the damp air like a whip, utterly devoid of the respect usually reserved for elders in the mountains. "Are you deaf or just dead standing up? Look at my front bumper. Some piece of garbage rock on your road just tore through my carbon fiber splitter, and the low-pressure warning light is screaming on my dash." I did not flinch, nor did he move toward the pristine vehicle that cost more than all the houses on this ridge combined. He stood by his workbench, his dark, weathered face remaining entirely unreadable, his eyes tracking the way the young man stepped over the dirty tools, as if the very air inside the garage were beneath him. "The mountain does not belong to me, young man," I replied, his voice low, steady, and remarkably calm, carrying the gravelly texture of someone who spoke rarely but observed everything. "And the road doesn't care about the price of your car when the earth decides to move." Fong took a step closer, his face twisting into a sneer of pure amusement and irritation, his expensive silk-lined jacket rustling as he pointed a manicured finger directly at the older man's chest. "I don't pay for lectures from people who live in shacks, old man," Fong snapped, reaching into his back pocket and pulling out a thick, tightly bound leather wallet, tossing a stack of crisp, uncirculated high-denomination bills onto the grease-stained counter between them. "There's 5 million VND right there, just for you to move your hands. Drop whatever garbage you're doing, get your tools out, and fix my tire right now. I have a private morning auction in the valley at 7, and I'm not letting a little mountain mud cost me a 10 billion VND deal." Ha looked down at the money resting on the wooden counter, right next to a small, hand-faded photograph of his wife Mai, smiling in front of a bush of wild hydrangeas. The 5 million VND could buy 2 weeks of post-operative medication, a drop in the massive bucket of the 40 million he still desperately needed to secure by sunrise. His hands, hidden inside the deep pockets of his denim jacket, curled into tight, rigid fists until his knuckles turned white against the fabric. But before he could speak, a heavy, sputtering cough from the darkness outside announced the arrival of another vehicle, its headlights dim, yellow, and flickering weakly through the downpour. An old, battered 12-seater commuter van, its green paint long since faded to a dull, rusty gray, rolled slowly into the perimeter of the station's light, its brakes emitting a terrifying, high-pitched metallic shriek that echoed off the mountain walls. The driver, a middle-aged man with red, sleep-deprived eyes and an old cloth cap soaked through with rain, practically threw himself out of the cabin, running toward Hai, with his hands raised in a gesture of pure desperation. "Uncle Ai, thank God you're still open," the driver gasped, his chest heaving, as he pointed back toward the van, where several pale, frightened faces were pressed against the fogged-up glass windows. "My brake fluid line just cracked 3 kilometers back near the cliff bend. I have 8 passengers in the back, laborers from the timber mill, and an old woman trying to get her grandson to the provincial hospital for an emergency fever. Barely held the steer, using the handbrake down the slope. If you don't help us, we won't survive the next 3 steep drops down the ridge." Hai turned his head slowly, his eyes moving past the shivering driver to the interior of the old van, where a young mother was tightly wrapping a crying child in a thin, wet woolen blanket. The boy's face was flushed dark red with a dangerous, burning heat. Fong let out a sharp, dry laugh, stepping directly into the path between Hai and the van driver, his expensive leather boots splashing a spray of dirty water onto the driver's worn canvas shoes. "Are you kidding me?" Fong said, his voice dripping with utter contempt as he looked at the old van like it was a pile of scrap metal waiting for the landfill. "That rusted piece of trash isn't worth the cost of my brake pads, let alone my time. Old man, I already bought your night. Tell this bus driver to park his wreck in the mud and wait until tomorrow. My car goes on the lift first." The wind slammed a sheets of freezing water directly under the awning, spraying across the small, faded photograph of Mai resting on the grease-stained counter. Hai did not look at the thick stack of currency Fong had carelessly tossed onto the wood. His eyes remained fixed on the young mother inside the old green van, her hands desperately chafing the tiny, burning feet of her shivering boy. Through the cracked window of the vehicle, the child's ragged, wheezing gasps could be heard even over the monstrous roar of the mountain storm. "Uncle Hi," the van driver pleaded, his lips turning a pale, bruising blue as he stood completely unprotected under the downpour, his hands shaking violently. The pressure in my brake pedal went completely soft right before the crest. "If you don't secure the copper line and bleed the air out, we will plunge over the side at the first hairpin turn down the pass." Fong let out a sharp, irritated click of his tongue, stepping forward and intentionally kicking a heavy iron tire iron across the floor to draw attention back to his sports car. "I don't care about a broken bus or some sick kid, old man," Fong said, his voice cold, sharp, and dripping with the absolute arrogance of someone who had never known a single day of deprivation. "My money is already on your counter, which means your time belongs to me until my car is back on the road. Do you even know who my father is? One phone call from me tomorrow morning, and this entire illegal shack will be bulldozed into the ravine." I stood completely motionless for 3 long, suffocating seconds, his large, calloused hands resting flat against the worn timber of his workbench. He was a man who had spent 32 years on this treacherous mountain road, watching the earth slip, the trees shatter, and human arrogance turn to dust under the weight of nature. He knew the exact price of every bolt, every patch of rubber, and every drop of sweat required to keep a soul safe on the death ridge. "Your money can buy a lot of things down in the city, young man," I said softly, his voice low and scraping like gravel, pulled from a riverbed, yet carrying a terrifying weight that made the van driver instantly fall silent. "But up here on this ridge, at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a landslide warning, currency doesn't hold the road. A human life does." Without a single glance toward the stack of 5 million VND, Hai turned his back on the luxury sports car, his heavy rubber boots splashing through the dirty water. As he walked directly toward his rolling tool cabinet, he gripped the rusted handle of a heavy hydraulic floor jack, his knuckles white and scarred from decades of slipped wrenches and jagged steel rims. His body screamed in protest, every muscle in his back burning with a deep, sickening exhaustion from working 18 hours without a moment of rest. The dull ache in his chest reminded him that his time was running out, that 40 million VND still stood between his wife and her chance at survival. If he took the young man's money, if he simply turned his tools toward the carbon fiber bumper, he would be 5 million VND closer to saving the woman who had shared his hard, impoverished life. But as he looked through the rain-streaked glass of the van and saw the old woman bowing her head in a silent, desperate prayer over her grandson, I knew some debts could never be paid in cash. "Uncle Lan," I called out to the van driver, his voice steady, as he hauled the heavy iron jack through the pouring rain toward the front axle of the green vehicle. "Get your passengers out of the cabin and bring them inside, near the wood stove behind the partition. The air is too thin out here for the boy." Fong's face flushed a deep, furious red, his jaw tightening so hard that the muscles along his neck bulged under his expensive silk collar. He had spent his entire life in glass boardrooms and luxury lounges where his family's name acted as a magic wand, causing grown men to bow and clear the path before him. To be utterly ignored by an old, grease-covered mechanic in a rusted mountain shack was an insult his pride could not endure. "You're making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life, old man," Fong hissed, stepping directly into the path of the jack, his pristine white sneakers now completely covered in thick, brown mountain mud. "I told you my car comes first. If you touch that piece of scrap metal van before you fix my low-pressure sensor, I will personally guarantee you never see a single customer on this pass again." I stopped pulling the jack, his dark, weathered eyes rising slowly to meet the young man's furious gaze. There was no anger in Hayes' face, no fear, and no desire to fight. There was only the absolute, terrifying discipline of a man who had faced down mountain storms longer than this boy had been alive. "Step back from the vehicle, son," I said, his tone perfectly flat, yet carrying the sharp authority of a commander on a battlefield. "The mud doesn't care about your shoes, and I don't care about your threats when there is a child burning up with fever 3 feet away from me." The van driver quickly ushered the shivering passengers out of the side door, guiding the young mother and the old woman past Fong, who drew back his silk jacket in disgust, as if their wet clothing might contaminate his wealth. Inside the small, cluttered office behind the garage bay, the low hum of an old cast-iron wood stove began to crackle, casting a faint, orange glow across the room. I knelt down in the freezing mud beneath the front bumper of the van, the icy rainwater pouring directly down the back of his neck, making his entire frame shiver uncontrollably. His hands were so cold, he could barely feel the cold steel of the 14-millimeter wrench between his fingers, but his movements remained precise, deliberate, and practiced. He reached up into the dark, greasy wheel well, his fingers tracing the slick, oily trail of the ruptured brake line, finding the jagged tear where a sharp piece of mountain shale had sliced through the flexible rubber hose. "The line is severed completely," I muttered to himself, his breath blooming into a thick cloud of gray vapor under the van's chassis. From the garage bay behind him, Fong pulled out his latest model smartphone, holding it high in the air as he paced furiously back and forth, trying to catch a single bar of cellular signal through the dense, heavy storm clouds. "No signal. This godforsaken mountain is a joke," Fong roared, slamming his palm against the sleek roof of his sports car, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and childish panic as the wind ripped another shingle from the roof above them. He looked back at the 5 million VND, still sitting on the counter, untouched, ignored, and getting slowly soaked by the spray of the storm. Hai remained on his knees in the freezing mud, his bare hands trembling as they clasped around the cold brass ring of his father's old pressure gauge. The storm above Mile 12 roared with a relentless, deafening thunder, shaking the wooden frame of the rescue station until the rusted iron roof sheets began to vibrate like old copper bells. But Hai was not listening to the thunder anymore. But his eyes were locked completely on the small, thick stream of dark red sludge that was slowly trickling out from beneath the dark stone cliff behind his workshop, running directly over his boots and into the open drainage trench. He rubbed a drop of the thick, viscous mud between his grease-stained fingers, feeling the heavy, granular texture of freshly liquefied clay mixed with shattered shale and tiny, snapped pine roots. It was not ordinary mud from a heavy mountain rainfall. It was the deep, ancient bedding soil that only moved when an entire mountainside lost its internal structure, liquefying under hours of unyielding hydraulic pressure from the upper springs. "The mountain is bleeding," I whispered to himself, his voice completely swallowed by the sound of a heavy gust of wind that slammed against the side partition. He stood up slowly, his old knees cracking loudly as he forced his aching body to stand straight beneath the flickering yellow bulb of the bay. His mind instantly raced down the pass, calculating every turn, every steep drop, and every weak retaining wall that he had watched the state builders erect 20 years ago. The exact spot where the dark red clay was escaping meant that the saturation zone was directly above the horseshoe, bend at kilometer marker 12, less than 400 meters from where they stood. If that section of the cliff gave way, thousands of tons of wet timber, ancient boulders, and suffocating mud would drop onto the asphalt within seconds, sweeping anything in its path straight into the bottomless ravine below. Fong noticed the old man standing still, staring into the dark rain, and he let out another loud, arrogant snort as he stuffed his hands deep into the dry pockets of his silk jacket. "What's the matter now, old man?" Fong shouted, stepping over a scattered wrench with an exaggerated stride to keep his mud-stained designer sneakers from sinking deeper into the slush. "Are you looking for another excuse to stretch out your clock so you can overcharge these losers? My watch says it's almost 4:30 a.m., and you haven't even touched my tires." I did not look at the young man, nor did he look at the 5 million VND that still sat crumpled and abandoned on the corner of his wet wooden workbench. He turned his back entirely on the luxury sports car, walking with heavy, purposeful strides into the heated office, where the 8 passengers of the commuter van were huddled around the old cast-iron wood stove. The young mother was rocking her small boy, whose wheezing breath had turned into a wet, terrifying rattle that vibrated through his tiny, fragile chest. "Uncle Lan," I said firmly, pointing a calloused finger toward the van driver, who was trying to dry his wet cap near the fire. "Your line is patched with a new copper sleeve, and I've bled the air out of the front calipers. You have enough pressure to hold the vehicle, but you cannot take the normal route down the western slope." The van driver blinked in confusion, his sleep-deprived eyes widening as he looked at the intense, unyielding seriousness on the old mechanic's weathered face. "But Uncle Hai," the driver stammered, "the western slope is the only paved way to the provincial hospital. If I take the old logging trail on the eastern ridge, it will add 40 minutes to the trip, and this child is burning up. If you take the western slope past the horseshoe bend, you won't make it to any hospital at all." I cut him off, his voice dropping into a low, iron-hard rasp that made every passenger in the room instantly freeze. "The red clay is running from the upper shelf. The whole face of mile 12 is going to come down before the sun clears the ridge. Take the eastern logging trail, keep your gear low, and do not press the brake unless you see an obstacle." The van driver looked at the old woman, then at the flushed face of the sick child, before nodding heavily with a profound, unshakable trust that only people of the mountains shared with their old mechanics. "We're leaving now," Lan called out, helping the young mother stand up as they hurriedly packed their few wet bags and moved back out toward the green commuter van. Fong stood by the entrance of the garage bay, his face twisting into a furious scowl of disbelief as he watched the group of poor laborers climb back into the old vehicle while his luxury car remained idle on the concrete floor. "Are you completely insane, old man?" Fong screamed, lunging forward and grabbing the sleeve of Hai's soaked denim jacket as the old mechanic stepped out into the rain to guide the van out. "You fixed that piece of garbage van. You're letting them drive away. And you haven't even looked at my low-pressure warning sensor. I told you I have a 10 billion VN auction in the city." I did not pull his arm away with force. He simply rotated his shoulder 3 inches, a subtle, heavy leverage technique he had learned from decades of wrestling massive tractor tires. The slight movement broke Fong's grip instantly, causing the young man to stumble back against the wet rear fender of his own sports car, his pristine silk sleeves smudged with black road green. "Listen to me very carefully, son," I said, his voice entirely devoid of anger, remaining as cold, clear, and unyielding as the mountain wind itself. "The road ahead is closed by the hand of God, not by my choice. If those people stay here, that boy's lungs will fail. If they take the western road, they die. My job is to keep them alive, not to cater to your auction." The green commuter van's engine sputtered to life with a loud, smoky rumble, its new copper brake lines holding perfectly as it backed out of the station and turned slowly toward the narrow, unpaved eastern logging trail. I stood under the downpour, waving his flashlight in a steady, slow arc until the dim yellow taillights of the van disappeared completely behind the thick curtain of mountain mist and dark pine trees. Fong wiped the mud from his hands using a white designer handkerchief, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, vindictive malice. He pulled out his phone again, desperate to find a single bar of roaming services. "You think you're some kind of local hero, don't you?" Fong hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of cold rain and pure, unadulterated humiliation as he stepped back under the tin awning. "You just threw away 5 million VND, and you chose a bunch of worthless peasants over a client who could buy this entire mountain. My father is Long Nguyen, the chairman of the Alpha Development Group." Fong pointed his phone directly at Hai's face, using the bright screen like a small weapon in the dark garage bay. "We already own the timber rights for the Eastern Reach," Fong continued, his teeth chattering from the cold, but his tone remaining sharp and venomous. "Tomorrow morning, I am going to make sure our legal team reviews the lease on this rescue station. You don't own this land, old man. You're a squatter in a rusted shack, and by noon tomorrow, I will have you and your tools thrown into the mud permanently." I did not look down at the ground, nor did he offer a single word of defense or apology to the young man whose family held the power to erase his entire existence with a stroke of a pen. He walked back over to his wooden workbench, picked up his old cloth rag, and began to carefully wipe the brown, muddy silt from the glass cover of his father's brass pressure gauge. His heart throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, the image of Mai's pale face in the hospital bed flashing behind his eyes like an unyielding shadow. He knew the young man was not lying. The great city development groups had been buying up the lower hills for 3 years, turning old homesteads into concrete luxury resorts and private hunting grounds. If they took this station away from him, he would lose the only home he had left, and the 40 million VND he needed by sunrise would become an impossible, distant dream. But as he held the heavy, solid brass of the gauge in his palm, he felt the weight of 3 generations of the Thamen Lank, men who had never bowed to a purse or a title, when the lives of travelers were on the line. "The Alpha Group can buy the trees, young man," I said softly, his voice barely rising above the rhythmic thudding of the rain against the metal roof above them. "But they can't buy the mountain when it decides to speak. You should get inside your car and lock the doors. The upper shelf is moving faster now." Suddenly, from the darkness behind the station, a high-pitched, terrifying crack echoed through the valley, a sound like 1,000 old oak trees snapping their spines at the exact same moment. The massive oak branch behind the station snapped with a wet, splintering crack, sliding down the muddy slope and slamming into the back wall of the workshop. The entire concrete floor vibrated beneath Hai's boots, causing 3 old steel rims stacked in the corner to clatter loudly against each other before falling into the slush. Fong flinched violently at the sound, his face losing its remaining color as he instinctively took 2 rapid steps backward toward the dry side panel of his sports car. Before he could loose another scream, the bright, piercing high beams of a massive black luxury armored SUV rounded the bend of mile 12, its heavy treaded tires carving effortlessly through the deep mud on the asphalt. The vehicle came to a slow, authoritative stop right behind Fong's low-slung sports car, its heavy diesel engine emitting a deep, rhythmic hum that completely filled the small garage bay. The heavy rear passenger door opened with a thick, vacuum-sealed soothe, and a tall, silver-haired man in a long, dark wool overcoat stepped out under the pouring rain. Long Nguyen, the chairman of the Alpha Development Group, did not look at his son first. His sharp, unblinking eyes scanned the flickering light of the station, taking in the scattered brass valves, the split wood box, and the wet, grease-stained frame of Hai. "Dad," Fong called out, his voice instantly switching from a venomous roar to a high-pitched, desperate whine as he ran toward the older man, his hands gesturing wildly toward the workshop. Thank God you're here. This crazy old mechanic has been wasting time fixing some worthless peasant's bus, while my car is sitting here with a damaged splitter and a failing tire sensor. He ignored my money, threatened me, and he's refusing to clear my path to the auction. Long Nguyen did not speak immediately, his heavy leather boots making slow, deliberate thuds against the wet concrete as he walked past his son, his gaze dropping to the floor. He stopped, right in front of the shattered wooden toolbox, his eyes tracking the old brass fittings scattered in the mud, before coming to a complete rest on the ancient brass pressure gauge that Hai was holding in his right hand. A strange, suffocating silence descended upon the entire station, a silence so thick that even the wind seemed to lose its edge for a fraction of a second. Longse's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, his rigid posture softening by a mere fraction of an inch as he stared at the hand-carved initials H. Nen, deeply engraved onto the base of the brass ring. Slowly, the powerful billionaire lifted his head, looking past the grease on Hai's face into the deep, tired eyes of the old mechanic who stood before him in a soaked denim jacket. Hai? Long asked, his voice no longer carrying the cold, corporate authority of a chairman, but a low, gravelly vibration that was thick with decades of unspoken history. Is that really you behind all that grease, old friend? Hai looked back at the man in the expensive wool coat, a faint, incredibly weary smile breaking through the crevices of his weathered face as he set the brass gauge gently back onto the dry edge of his workbench. It's been a long time. Long, Hai said softly, his voice steady, calm, and perfectly grounded. 31 years since the old road construction brigade broke up on the southern pass. Fong stood completely frozen between the two older men, his mouth slightly open, as his mind struggled to process the words passing between his powerful father and this penniless mountain mechanic. Dad, Fong stammered, his voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and sudden, icy dread. What are you talking about? You know this man? He's just a squatter, living in a rotting tin shack. Long Nguyen turned his head slowly toward his son, his eyes turning into two frozen slits of pure, unadulterated anger that made Fong instinctively choke back his next sentence. This squatter, as you call him, was the lead engineer who pulled my body out of a crushed truck cabin during the Sat Law of 1995 while your mother was pregnant with you, Long said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet whisper that cut through the sound of the rain like steel. He gave up his own government retirement pension to stay on this ridge and keep this rescue station open so travelers wouldn't die in the dark. And you came into his house and threw his father's tools into the mud? Before Fong could utter a single word of defense, the heavy emergency bodam on Hai's workbench suddenly crackled to life with a loud, static-filled scream from the valley control tower down below. Attention all units on mile 12. Total structural failure at kilometer marker 12, Horseshoe Bend. The entire western face of the mountain has just collapsed. Thousands of tons of rock and timber have swept across both lanes. The road is entirely gone. The voice on the radio gasped for breath before continuing through the static. An old green commuter van just reported safe arrival via the old Eastern Logging Trail. They confirmed that a mechanic named Hai warned them away from the bend just 10 minutes before the slide occurred. If any vehicle is still headed down the western slope, abort immediately. Fong's knees went completely soft, his phone slipping from his numb fingers and cracking against the concrete right next to a scattered copper washer. He looked out into the pitch-black darkness of the western road, realizing that if Hai had listened to his money, if Hai had put his sports car on the lift first, he would have been driving exactly through that horseshoe bend. At the precise moment the mountain fell. His 5 million bene de, his 10 billion bomene di action, and his immense family wealth would have been crushed under 100 feet of suffocating red clay and shattered boulders. The young man's chest heaved as a cold, terrifying wave of realization washed over his pride, leaving him shivering, small, and utterly stripped of his corporate armor under the dim yellow bulb of the station. Long Nguyen looked at his son's pale face, then at the thick stream of dark red sludge still flowing through the drainage trench, before turning back to Hai with a look of profound, heavy gratitude. "You saved him," Long said quietly, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped forward and placed a heavy palm on the shoulder of the old mechanic's wet denim jacket. "Even after he insulted your life, even after he broke your things, you stayed in the mud to make sure he didn't drive down into his own grave." Hai shook his head slowly, his eyes looking down at the hand-faded photograph of Mai, sitting safely on the dry shelf. "I didn't do it for him, Long," I said softly, his voice carrying the pure, unyielding truth of a man who had never lost his soul to the world. "I did it because the road doesn't allow a man to trade a life for a stack of paper, no matter how much that paper is worth." Long Nguyen stepped back from the open radio, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line as he stared down at the split-open wooden box and the cracked phone screen on the floor. The wind howled with a renewed, violent fury, shaking the heavy steel columns of the rescue station, as if the mountain itself were confirming the catastrophic report. "You heard the radio, Fong," Long said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that made his son's chest heave with an icy, breathless panic. "If Hai had listened to your money, if he had serviced your toy car first, you would have been accelerating right into that horseshoe bend at the exact second the cliff face detached." Long reached into his own wool overcoat, pulled out his personal leather organizer, and drew a sleek, heavy gold fountain pen from its sleeve with a slow, deliberate motion. "Your arrogance didn't just insult an old man tonight," Long continued, his eyes remaining fixed on his son's shaking hands. "It almost buried you under 10,000 tons of mountain mud." With a sharp, fluid stroke, Long signed his name to a blank, official bank draft, tore the heavy paper from the book, and set it firmly on the dry wood of Hai's workbench. "That draft is drawn directly on the Alpha Group's primary account," Long said, turning back to the old mechanic with a look of deep, sorrowful respect. "Write whatever number you need to secure my surgery at the Central Hospital by 7:30 this morning, and consider the rest a permanent endowment for this station." Fong swallowed hard, a sudden, desperate hope flaring in his eyes as he took a half step toward his father, his hand reaching out instinctively toward the car keys. "Dad, please," Fong whined, his voice cracking with a childish, terrified plea. "The road is gone, but we can take the SUV back down the eastern ridge. I need to get back to the city. I can't stay in this place." Long Nguyen did not look at his son. He extended his hand, his palm flat and unmoving, as he waited for Fong to drop the keys to the luxury sports car into his grip. "You're not going back to the city, Fong," Long said, his voice clipping each word with the absolute finality of an executioner's blade. "Your cards are frozen as of this second. The lease on your apartment is terminated, and the keys to this sports car stay with my security team." Long pointed a long, rigid finger down at the scattered brass fittings, the specialized wrenches, and the ancient pressure gauge resting in the dirty puddle of the bay. "You are staying right here at mile 12, Long commanded, his voice rising above the rhythmic thudding of the storm. "You will sleep on the cot in the back office. You will eat whatever rice Hai gives you, and you will spend the next 90 days looting in this mud as his assistant." Fong's lips parted in a silent, horrified gasp his eyes darting to the giant security officer Owen, who stepped up behind him like a solid wall of dark fabric. "If you leave this ridge before the 90 days are marked," Long added, "I will personally hand the police the full financial audit of your regional procurement files from last quarter." Fong collapsed backward onto the cold leather seat of his sports car, his hands dropping into his lap as his entire world of unearned privilege shattered into dust. I did not look at the check on his workbench, nor did he look at the broken figure of the young man who had slandered his life only an hour before. He picked up his old copper line flaring tool, his bare hand steady despite the freezing chill, and began to carefully arrange his scattered implements back onto the dry shelf. "The surgery cost is 40 million VND. Long," I said quietly, his voice perfectly clear and unburdened by greed. "I will take exactly 40 million from this paper as a loan, and I will send you the monthly service invoices for every Alpha timber truck that crosses this pass until the debt is cleared." Long looked at the old mechanic, a thick, emotional warmth rising in his chest as he recognized the same unyielding dignity that had kept them both alive 3 decades ago. "As you wish, old friend," Long whispered, nodding slowly. "The road always knows who belongs to it." By 5:45 a.m. the heavy, suffocating blackness above the death ridges began to soften into a pale, translucent shade of slate gray as the eye of the storm passed eastward. The rain had reduced to a steady, rhythmic drizzle, washing the thick layers of dark red sludge from the concrete apron into the valley below. Outside the garage bay, the massive black SUV was gone, having departed down the safe eastern logging trail with Long Nguyen's legal team to deliver the bank draft directly to the hospital staff. Inside the bay, Fong sat on an old, overturned plastic oil crate, his expensive silk jacket discarded on the floor, his hands covered in black grease that wouldn't wash out. His body shook with a deep, hollow chill, his muscles cramping from hours of bending over the wet concrete under high, silent, unyielding supervision. "Pick up the 10mm socket, young man," I said calmly from the workbench, his voice carrying neither anger nor triumphalism, only the quiet authority of an instructor. "It's resting near the edge of the drainage trench. Wipe the silt from the threads before you place it back into the case." Fong did not answer with a sneer, nor did he look at his luxury watch, which had stopped ticking after a drop of muddy water entered the rose gold bezel during the storm. He dragged his wet sneakers through the slush, reached his hand down into the cold water, and pulled the tiny steel socket out of the mud, wiping it carefully against his denim sleeve. As he looked at his own reflection in the wet glass of the garage door, his face smudged with soot and his hair matted with rain, the image of his own Ngao Man seemed like a distant, foreign dream. He looked toward the small office, where the cast iron wood stove was still casting a faint, comforting amber glow through the small window pane. On the wall beside the old register, the tiny faded photograph of Mai seemed to catch the first faint ray of morning light breaking through the pine trees. He realized then that the old man had not saved his life because he wanted a reward, nor had he refused his money because he wanted to play the hero for the crowd. He had done it because his soul was anchored to something that didn't fluctuate with the market, something that couldn't be bought by the Alpha Group or managed by a corporate board. "I'm sorry about the box," Fong muttered softly, his voice dropping into his chest as he set the cleaned tool gently into the hand-carved wooden tray. I stopped his work for a brief second, his large, scarred fingers resting on the handle of his father's brass pressure gauge before he turned his head slowly toward the young man. "The wood can be glued back together, son," I said, his tone milder than it had been all night, carrying a quiet, redemptive softness. "But a man's character, once it slides down the mountain, takes a whole lifetime of Loy Bun to haul back up to the ridge. Outside, the morning mist began to rise off the valley floor, revealing the raw, jagged scar where the western face of Mile 12 had torn away from the peak, sweeping millions of tons of debris into the void. The road was gone, but the station remained standing, its flickering yellow bulb finally turning off as the full light of day broke over the ridge. The telephone on the wooden counter rang with a sharp, piercing chime, breaking the sacred quiet that had settled over the warm office. I lifted the receiver with a trembling, oil-stained hand, holding his breath as he pressed the cold plastic against his ear. The voice of the chief surgeon from the city's central hospital came through clearly, unburdened by the storm or the distance. The surgery was a complete success, the doctor said, and Mai was already resting peacefully in the recovery ward with stable vital signs. Ai's throat tightened, a single, hot tear cutting a clean path through the black grease on his weathered cheek before disappearing into his collar. He did not shout with joy, nor did he break into a dramatic speech to celebrate the miracle he had prayed for through 18 long hours of darkness. He slowly set the receiver back down onto its cradle, turned his head toward the small window, and looked out at the morning light. Fong stood near the tire rack, his hands raw and blistered from a night of hauling steel, watching the old man with a quiet, anxious intensity. "She's safe, young man," I said softly, his voice carrying a deep, echoing resonance that seemed to heal the very walls of the old shack. "The debt to the hospital is cleared, and the road has allowed us both to see the sunrise." Fong let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping as the final remnants of his corporate pride dissolved into the damp mountain air. He looked down at his ruined designer clothing, then at his grease-covered palms, and for the first time in his life, he felt a strange sense of clean, honest relief. Over the next 3 months, the old rescue station at Mile 12 did not disappear from the maps of the Death Ridge, as the city developers had planned. Long Nguyen kept his promise to the letter, sending his finest engineers and materials up the Eastern Trail to restore what time and neglect had eroded. The rusted corrugated iron roof was replaced with heavy, insulated steel panels that no longer rattled when the winter gales came howling through the peaks. The cracked concrete floor was reinforced. The ancient, shorting electrical grid was replaced with safe, industrial wiring, and a modern hydraulic lift was installed in the main bay. But the faded blue wooden sign hanging above the entrance remained completely untouched, its hand-painted letters still welcoming travelers in need of shelter. Megan and Lan returned every week, bringing fresh provisions from the valley and sharing stories with the drivers who now stopped at the station by choice rather than by accident. As for Fong, he remained at the ridge for 90 consecutive days, his hands growing thick with calluses and his mind learning the heavy, unyielding discipline of the mountain. He no longer carried the thick leather wallet or wore the rose gold luxury watch, but he knew the exact weight of a 14mm wrench and the precise sound of a failing brake cylinder. He had learned to read the red clay in the water, to respect the laborers who crossed the pass with counting dollars, and to understand that some values could never be measured on a corporate balance sheet. On the final morning of his sentence, as his father's black SUV arrived to take him back to the glass boardrooms of the city, Fong stopped by the workbench. He reached down and picked up the old brass pressure gauge, setting it gently into a brand-new, hand-carved mahogany tool case he had built with his own hands during the quiet nights. "Thank you, Uncle Hai," Fong said quietly, bowing his head in a sincere, deeply grounded gesture of respect that no amount of money could ever buy. "For not letting me drive into the ravine when I was too blind to see the edge." I smiled faintly, his large, scarred hand resting briefly on the young man's shoulder before he turned back to the open garage bay to greet the first truck of the morning. The whole cafe went silent because truth finally had a voice, and sometimes that is the only miracle an honest worker needs to keep the light safe for the rest of the world. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments what moment stayed with you most, whether it was Hai's unyielding discipline, Fong's profound transformation, or the terrifying warning of the mountain clay. And if you believe that quiet dignity and human life still hold more value than a stack of paper in a world that often rewards arrogance, share this tale with someone who needs to remember. Thank you for watching Dad Life Stories, and we will see you on the next pass.